Okay, hi. I'm going to talk about book two of Plato's Republic today. Book one, the famous confrontation between Thrasymachus and Socrates when Thrasymachus is arguing that might makes right. But book two is a transitional sort of dialogue where Plato comes to terms with, where Socrates, Socrates, the character in Plato's dialogue, comes to terms with the characters addie and Glaucon, who are actually in real life Plato's two older brothers, his eldest brother Adimantus and the middle brother Glaucon. And Glaucon is accompanying Socrates to the festival in the Piraeus because it's thought that Glaucon could stand to use some time with Socrates. But in any event, at the beginning of the dialogue, they're taking up in a sort of sporting and sort of student-like fashion Thrasymachus's arguments. They try and polish those arguments up and see if they can make them fly. And then by the end of book two, what we find is that Socrates has at least got the brothers now to the point where they're going to listen to what he says. And of course, we know now also that the setup is their test of justice. So let me go to the slides then. And again, I'm calling this the there. Plato's Republic, Book Two, Plato's brothers and the influence of Socrates. As I say, he sort of has to massage them. They really aren't sure what to, or Adimantus in any event, it really isn't sure what to make of Socrates at the beginning of Book Two. And by the end of Book Two, he says, all right, now I'll go on and listen to what it is that Socrates has to say. And of course, this is setting up then this whole first half of the Republic, which we generally think of as in terms of the education of the guardians. I'm going to go into it a little bit more literally perhaps than that today and try and highlight a couple of what I see as philosophical issues here. So I'm going to take my time, but I don't think it'll take too long. I think we have about a dozen slides or so. So book one relates to confrontation between Socrates and Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus saying that justice is the rule of the stronger. I see this really not as a prescriptive sort of demand on the part of Thrasymachus. I don't think there's another sort of meta level where Thrasymachus saying what it ought to be is the rule of the stronger. I think that what Thrasymachus is saying is descriptive. That is, I think he says it in a descriptive spirit. He says, look around, fellas, and what you'll see is that what's real, reality is the rule of the stronger. And I've talked a little bit about this interpretation that I think is very important. Let me just mention it briefly now at the beginning. In fact, I'll just step out of it just to do it quickly here. So central part of my interpretation of this is cosmological. Probably have a little note like this in each of the videos explaining that. What does it mean? The materialists, like the old, like the followers of the old Homeric and poets, are people who see a universe of violence and random paradox, an amoral universe. Some of this is similar to what we find in the early modern period when the new science is presenting people with what appears to be an amoral world under scientific description. The Ionian naturalists at the time, people like Anaxagoras and Heraclitus are providing this kind of picture. And so this reason for this, the sophists like Protagoras and Thrasymachus and Gorgias and so on, they want to say that really human beings need to construct their own conventions and make their own truth because they live in a paradoxical coming to be and passing away world of flux where there isn't really anything like that. So Heraclitus, for example, says, guard your law as you would your city wall. And Plato doesn't think that's right. And what he doesn't think is right is that initial sort of physical description of the universe. He thinks that the universe itself is a kind of ordered place and that value comes from the world. So that's this kind of underlying issue that's always informing the discussion. So going back to the share then, and this is then a lot of what he's talking about with Thrasymachus, because Thrasymachus who thinks that Socrates is some kind of trickster and that Socrates isn't on the level, because Thrasymachus really thinks that he's just, as I said, describing the world and saying, this is really the way that the world is. Um, and that is, again, in second bullet point there, he thinks that power relationships are the only things holding the world together. So essentially, this sophistic Protagorean view of the necessary convention of human power relationships is that if not for those, then what you would have is all the random human atoms just clashing with each other. Okay, uh, so it's, and so the power relationships are the only way that it's going to be, and you sort of look around and that's what you see. And Thrasymachus, by the way, and he says this in his discussion with Socrates, you can take any political system that you want. You're talking about democracy and oligarchy and meritocracy and all these things. Uh, but it doesn't matter what the political theory is. You're always going to see power relationships because those are just, again, this glue that's holding that polis together. Um, so it's important to see that. And now Thrasymachus, he actually lingers during book 2 and is in fact listening. He doesn't leave until later, but uh, he um, he hands it over now to Glaucon and Adimantus. Probably, I mean, Thrasymachus is going to tell us that he's doing it because he's just tired with this, but really, Thrasymachus also has had a little moment where he's realized that maybe Socrates was onto something, and now he's actually listening. Book 2, as I said, is this kind of transition where Socrates comes in and he has to sort of prove himself to get everybody to listen to him, and that's sort of what book 2 is kind of about in some ways. So okay, so Thrasymachus. And then, so Glaucon and Adimantus. Let's talk about Glaucon first. I say they're the phenomenology of justice. They are interested, the brothers, in justice as a sort of internal condition or state of mind, because you've got goods that are instrumental goods only. You have goods that are goods in themselves, and you have goods that are both instrumental goods and goods in themselves. Um, and Socrates wants to say that justice is, of course, of that third type, the best, one that is both an instrument to other goods, but also something that is a good in itself. Glaucon's question about that, Glaucon's the younger one. He's the sensualist. That's why he's hanging out with Socrates. Um, he has all kinds of tastes. Later in the book, Socrates is teasing him about his tastes in different kinds of boys that he meets at these big festivals that they have. Um, so Glaucon is what we call a hedonistic. Now, in popular language, hedonism is just sort of a playboy kind of type of, some a creature of pleasure kind of thing. But when we say hedonism in ethical theory, that's actually a philosophical term of art, meaning any theory that says ultimately it's these kinds of sensual pleasure goods, which are the ultimate goods. And full disclosure, I mean, I sort of see a lot in that myself, but um, I mean, it does kind of make sense. In Glaucon's case, he doesn't hold the theory that all goods are goods of qualitative goods of sensual pleasure, like Jeremy Bentham seems to hold somehow. Glaucon doesn't hold that. It's only that Glaucon is kind of a young man who likes to go to parties and likes to dance and likes to listen to music. Socrates says that Glaucon pours music into his ears with a funnel. Um, and so Glaucon's notion of a good, his notion of pleasure is a kind of sensual, physical notion. So he understands the phenomenology of goodness as the phenomenology of the good taste of the spaghetti sauce, or the good ecstatic feeling at the dance. And so when he says, "What's the good of justice? How is justice a good in itself?" And so Socrates really there is going to have to explain to Glaucon before he can explain that. I mean, Glaucon's going to have to be brought around to the idea, or that there may be things that are goods which are not these kind of qualitative, experiential, sensual goods. So is Glaucon really representing the body. Uh, and that's really emphasized throughout the dialogue. Again, Glaucon's kind of hedonistic ways and his taste for those pleasures. But as I say there in the last bullet point, justice is not a material passion at all. This is something Kant understands as well. Kant understands that it's got to be that you're acting out of duty, the duty that you see as incumbent upon you as a rational being. And Kant, in Kant's case, he deliberately thinks very much that it's got to be that you're doing the universalizing in order to get away from your own tastes and your own inclinations and your own contingent desires and so on. Something going on like that here anyway, but in any event, you see the issue with Glaucon. He wants to know how it is that I might enjoy justice. But his notion of enjoyment is a very much essential sort of physical notion of enjoyment. It looks like justice, like mathematics, not coincidentally at all, is not a matter of the body. So is not a passion at all. Ordinarily in Plato translations, the passions are those feelings and motivations which are caused by your physical body. So hunger would be a good example of a passion there. And then there's addie, and addie in book 2 is really more important, I think, than Glaucon. I think Plato sort of deals with the relationship between Socrates and addie, although it does go on, and you'll notice at the beginning of book 3, I think it's one of the most patently comic passages in the Republic when Socrates is really teasing addie. But here we are in book 2, and addie has come along. Addie was with the other gang, with Polemarchus and his friends. He's one of Polemarchus's friends, and they were at the festival, and they're the ones who ran into Socrates and Glaucon and asked them, and they ended up all in the house talking together. And so addie, the eldest brother, was in that party. But addie is feels responsible for Glaucon, and everybody understands that Glaucon needs a tutor, that it's time for Glaucon to get some discipline. But addie isn't sure about Socrates. Socrates is kind of notorious. Not everybody agrees that Socrates is the best sort of teacher. So addie has proprietary questions. Addie represents someone living in the world of the many. He's focused on the tree in front of him and not the forest. And this is his fundamental misunderstanding with Socrates. He always wants to know the specific thing. Socrates really wants to give sort of a functional, if you will, account of something that isn't in terms of the physical thing. But addie does. So it's a good device, really, because addie keeps asking for very specific things, much to Socrates' impatience, because addie wants to know, well, what is it really? Because addie really literally wants to know, what are you going to be teaching Glaucon? Like which songs, what music, what poetry, I mean, literally that's what he wants to know. So he's not just the guy who only can't see the forest for the trees, but really he's focused on one tree. His project in talking to Socrates is really to figure out what Socrates' teaching is from the perspective of the older brother who would like to know whether it's pernicious or whether it's salutary. And so Socrates' achievement at the end of book 2 is that addie now is reasonably sure that Socrates' teachings are salutary. So that's part of what's going on in this book. But to understand the interplay between Socrates and addie, you see that's always what it is. It's always addie interrupting. And by the way, addie always interrupts Socrates. Socrates is always speaking when addie starts to speak, because addie is always breaking in and saying, yeah, but what's the specific detail about that? So in a way, you can see Glaucon as the body and Socrates as the form, or the rational mind, if you will. And then in that case, addie is kind of that interaction between form and matter. It's a tripart model, right? And so that interactive force, whatever that is, it's a problem for Plato's metaphysics, is maybe represented by addie, or to keep it simple, as in the Phaedrus, say, and the two horses pulling the chariot, Glaucon represents passion, addie represents prudential reason. So you could think of it as sort of those are Plato's older brothers, right? So they're representing sort of the two sides of Plato. Now, another thing, the last bullet point on this slide, I say there that Socrates doesn't want to talk about all this. He wants to leave, but Uh, but they talk about it. And so there's a little interesting, that opens up some interesting space between the protagonist, the character, and the author that we'll talk about a little bit right now, pretty much. So the famous Ring of Gyges, the Ring of Gyges gives one the power of invisibility. And the point of this, Glaucon tells the story, is Glaucon is saying, remember, he's still trying to sort of defend Thrasymachus's position that might makes right. And Glaucon says, notice it's a social contract theory. He says, look, anybody would act like this if they had that kind of ultimate power. So he's just giving you a fairly negative view of human nature, negative or perhaps simply an amoral view of human nature. Again, human beings just sort of these self-interested atoms kind of bashing around into them. You know, it's interesting in the second bullet point there, I mentioned Thomas Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan, an early version of liberal social contract theory. He wrote it in the 1500s. Um, uh, he's looking at Galileo, and he's thinking, well, okay, Galileo sees everything as matter and motion. And so Hobbes is thinking human beings are matter and motion. And then Hobbes says, you know, human beings should be able then to move towards the objects of their desire. And that's this very simple definition of freedom. And from that, he develops a social contract theory. Very, very similar to the reasoning of the sophist social theorists who Plato is dealing with here. That is, they just think that, again, the world itself is this kind of violent place. Humans are part of that world. A typical problem that relativistic theories sort of have, remember, a problem for relativism, among other things, sort of can't be wrong if anything's true just because you believe it. And a problem for this sort of perspectivalist social theory that we get from the sophists is that if human beings, after all, are just another part of this random, violent, paradoxical world of becoming and passing away, then where do human beings ever get the capacity to develop these systems, these prosthetic conventions that protect them from the chaos without? See what I mean? It looks like that's a problem. Well, again, the cosmology with the social contract theory. You have to have a social contract theory because, in fact, what people are these independent atoms, kind of each one pursuing its own course, and there's no unity. It's the world of the many. It's the world of the many, and that's the world of all against all. And that is the description of the universe that people like Protagoras and Thrasymachus endorse. And as such, then Glaucon will say, well, isn't that then limiting me? When I enter in the social contract, it's a contract that puts limits on me, with the implication that otherwise I'd do those things. Socrates, or more specifically Plato, because Plato is much clearer on all the details. He's the genius who's worked out the metaphysics and epistemology in a systematic way. Okay. He thinks that when form and matter are interacting in the right combination in anything, because everything is a mix of form and matter. An intelligible thing is intelligible. What that means is that it's participating enough in form, the matter is participating in form enough that it can be assigned to a category. It can be identified as a member of a category, as something. So, and this comes to be and passes away from matter. Matter isn't constantly coming to be into enough form to be recognizable and intelligible, and then losing that form. So, so Plato then is a moral realist. What does that mean? Someone who believes there are moral facts. The moral fact, in this case, that is the value-producing fact. Because it's not just a moral fact. The source of all value in the world is the source of all intelligibility in the world, which is the participation of matter and form. And so that's what you want. That's truly what is the good. So So again, then that involves no sacrifice. That is, in fact, becoming just involves fulfillment of one's nature on the Platonic view. Uh, well, Adimantus, wants to really talk some common sense to Socrates. He thinks, he's not sure Socrates, Socrates is this philosopher. He calls himself a gadfly. I mean, Adimantus isn't sure uh, about all this. And he makes just what he takes to be a common sense appeal. He's giving Socrates credit for being a rational, responsible adult man, and he's appealing to him as Glaucon's older brother. And he says, look, Socrates, the first bullet point, uh, the reason that fathers teach this rhetoric from him, the rhetoric of justice, if you are justice, you get prosperity, honor, and the love of the gods. And so, those are patently second order. Then justice is a second order good. Second, you want your son to be just because you want your son to enjoy prosperity and honor and so on. So, that's it. And again, that is conventional behavior. You have to behave properly because we have a socially constructed edifice, which is our polis, that we have to maintain. So this is self-control, just like Glaucon says. This is self-control. Otherwise, right, we'd be sensualists running amok, I guess, according to someone like Glaucon. He finds that idea more relatable than maybe some of the rest of us. So this is an art, right? This is the artful, tactful, polite, civilized person. They have mastered this art. It is a secondary good, a means to an end. And it was established, as we're on the second bullet point here still, it was established, and it's a really important point from book one, that the navigator may be really good at getting from point A to point B. And the well-socialized person may be really good at navigating their way through the reception and dealing with all the politics of the people. But it's the captain who knows where it ought to go, where the boat should sail, to where the boat ought to sail. And similarly, you could master all those social arts and diplomatic and political arts, and that doesn't guarantee at all that you're the person who we ought to consult as to what it is that we should do with those abilities. So then last bullet point, again, this is where he's really just sort of saying, okay, Socrates, but I mean, come on. He says, look, Adimantus implores Socrates not to influence Glaucon to valorize one concept of justice, because Socrates is talking about this mysterious good, or something, or justice as some real thing. And it sounds a little voodoo. Glaucon says, look, you project conventional justice with your behavior while remaining unjust in the sophistic sense. But the sophistic sense of unjust, again, this is why people don't appreciate Thrasymachus. The sophistic sense of maintaining realism. All unjust means is that there aren't any real values in the world, right? There isn't really anything like that. And so you have to be realistic like that to keep your feet on the ground in the absence of any innate justice in the cosmos, or for that matter, among humans. And Adimantus is saying to Socrates, this is true, Socrates. I mean, I hope you're not going to tell him to believe in Beelzebub or some crazy specific thing, because after all, that's not what a worldly man thinks. This one there, yeah, okay. So then we get sort of Socrates' political anthropology, and I think it is a kind of political anthropology. Um, let me step out, in fact, even for a second here. So I've been talking about social contract theory that the sophists, influenced by the new naturalism, had, but also social contract theory as we find it in early modern philosophy as well. And of course, there's a certain element of figurative ideation there, because obviously this Rousseauian version, everyone comes together in a field and shakes hands and agrees to be involved in a contract like that, is clearly not really what happened. Well, okay, when you look at that, I mean, I would say that anybody interested in the behavioral sciences, or social and political philosophy ought to start off with a good course in primatology, because if it's something that all the primates do, then that's, something that's pretty much to the bone. You could take that to be a kind of, built-in behavior. Okay, so, all right, well, let's get back to it. Back to sharing the screen. I'll go back to that if I can remember that. Oh yeah. Let me. Okay, so I'm sorry, I forgot what I was going to say, but now I remember it again. Organic social theory. Organic social theory, which is also very characteristic of, say, Chinese social theory, in as much as that's Confucian, and Taoism is consistent with that as well. Stoicism. Socrates, by the way, is much aligned with the Stoics as any other philosophical group. Uh, the idea that you go along with nature, the idea that you become powerful to the extent that you're sort of cooperating with nature. So, anyway, I would just make the common sense observation, it's an empirical observation, that human beings were social, found in social groups before they were human beings. Our hominid ancestors were social animals. And intelligent race of extraterrestrials who only had one human body, looking at the way as our bodies are organized and built, could easily tell that we were beings who lived in groups, who were social beings, who depended on some kind of biological collective to survive, which we are. So organic social theory, or Aristotle gets criticized for this, right? Because Aristotle seems very conservative, in as much as he sort of sees the parts of the household as these kind of natural things and just catalogs them, including, women and slaves and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, but again, the attitude is not that we're doing human social science and that's different from the rest of the natural biological science. That's kind of a post-Cartesian idea, I think, that we don't find amongst the ancient Greeks. Certainly not with Aristotle. He's a biologist through and through, including when he's talking about human beings. So organic social theory versus social contract theory. Organic social theory just sees the human collective as a naturally occurring thing, as a part of nature, and then can talk about what is salutary, right, for such a thing. Um, I think that's important. I think that's a real important takeaway from looking at Asian philosophy as well. Um, so Socrates describes then the first city, the naturally occurring city, the city then that emerges when the form is mixing with the matter, and you get, the emergence of this instantiation of form, the polis, the city. Second bullet point, again, very much like what we find described in Chinese social theory. Um, the original unevolved polis is a leaderless place. The good leader, according to Confucian teaching, needs to do very, very little because everything is operating naturally. Each person functions in their natural role. And the simple necessities of life are economically provided because those means of production just evolved completely naturally. They were just the obvious ones. Um, this is ataraxis, I think. I think this. That is kind of a state of peaceful satisfaction. I think, again, that's another link maybe to Eastern thinking. But in any event, and Cephalus was our example of that at the beginning of book one. But in the material world, everything's always coming to be and passing away. So such a thing comes to be and then passes away. And Socrates, in talking about then the evolution of the city, in some ways, I think from his point of view, it's he definitely says that original, I'll call it the ataraxic city, is the best city. So now, and this is also an expositional observation. Glaucon is listening to this, and he calls this the city that Socrates is talking about, the sort of original city that's organized naturally, where everyone just sort of does their natural thing. And what they do is make their food, clothing, and shelter. He calls it a city of pigs. Glaucon is meaning something like they're all too satisfied, they're just sitting around, there's no adventure, and it's too boring. Glaucon is the one who's got some materialism problems. It's unfortunate, I think. I actually think, looking at the secondary literature, that this translation of the phrase as city of pigs kind of is a distraction, and kind of maybe isn't contributing to the best interpretations of these passages. In any event, the only sense in which it's the city of pigs is that the pigs are satisfied and they're lying around not doing anything. Um, in fact, and I think this is really important, and I think there's reasons perhaps why maybe 20th century America didn't, really emphasize this in our Platonic studies. In the second bullet point, and that is that materialism is the downfall of the ataraxic city. But of course it is, because the intelligible thing, intelligible because it is participating in form, comes to be and passes away, and it passes away by sinking back down into matter. And indeed, matter comes to encrust and eventually overwhelm the original city. And you get social stratification, and then you get more and more politics. And again, as I said in the second bullet point there, you get all this luxury, and that's all again falling down into materialism. Glaucon says that sounds great. See, what the thing is I want to point out here is that there's no doubt at all that what we find here is a critique of the idea that the right way to run an economy, or the right model of economy, is an expanding economy. An expanding economy is an economy that's got the sort of disease of materialism. And it's also going to lead to conformity and loss of identity. And these people, Socrates and Plato have, Socrates especially has a real authenticity fetish. And not only that, but war and armies and violence. Socrates says, look, violence comes from that. You're going to need more luxuries. You're going to need more land. You're going to need meat. Everyone's going to want meat. So you're going to become richer, which is exactly something happening in contemporary times, by the way. Because after all, this intelligible thing, in this case, the polis, it could just dissipate back into matter and cease to exist altogether, which in Plato's version of ceasing to exist is coming to no longer be a polis, because it's lost too much of that definition. But you could try to preserve it. Now, and then notice it's not that different from the sophists. The sophists think that you're sort of fighting against entropy in a way. You're fighting against chaos. And Socrates is saying you're always fighting against this law of materialism. So let's talk about something about this, because the Kallipolos is always, the ideal city, Plato's utopia. It's a utopian work, and he's describing it when he describes the Kallipolis, the ideal city. But Socrates says very explicitly that it's this original ataraxic city that's the best city. That's the city where you have the most authentic human beings living their best life. And if the ataraxic city is the best city, then the Kallipolos is not. The Kallipolos is not, Socrates, tell us what you think would be the very best city that could possibly exist. That's not what Socrates is describing in the Republic. He's saying, look, given that we have the state that we're in, given that we have the materialism and the class structure and the politics and so on that we have, and again, Plato, like so many historic writers, is writing in the face of a lot of political violence that's really cut him to the quick, and that's part of his project here. So Socrates is saying, well, what I would do if we, were to have, say, some kind of revolution, is this, and that then is his prescription for the balm or the therapy that the sick city needs. The city's already sick. So the Kallipolos is not ideal, because the Kallipolos is a response to sickness and decay. In the original city, you didn't need anything like that. So as I say in that third bullet point, like I just said, it's a really interesting parallel with the Sophists. According to the Sophists, guard your city as you would your city, guard your city as your law as you would your city wall. That is, understand that it's the social conventions that are the only thing that protect us from the chaos without. Um, but Plato's worried about the original sin of falling down into materiality and into incarnation, and that's got to be resisted. We've got to dry out our souls. Our souls love to become wet, but the good soul is dry. Um, and as you say, now this is another thing. This is something that comes up here, of course, during these books, in the first part of the Republic, that typically you'll get a group of people studying the book will revolt, and they'll say, well, he's really authoritarian. He's some kind of totalitarian. He's too Nazi for us. Um, but and so you've got this class, right? The Guardians, and they're sort of this paramilitary class. But notice the last bullet point on the slide here, because I think this is important. Materialism leads to violence. You have an army because there's a demand for luxury goods such as meat. These armies existed. There were citizen hoplite volunteer armies, big infantry armies, and they did engage in these fights with their neighbors, mostly for economic and territorial reasons at the end. Um, but he says, one thing that, and this we'll get into this in book 5, which is the most provocative of all these books, I think. Uh, he says, look, the state needs to, you can't get rid of violence. This will be the argument roughly, right? But then the state needs to have a monopoly on violence, so the violence can be rationalized. Um, and it's actually a man problem. Like men are prone to irrational violence. I mean, that's really something that Plato thinks, and we'll talk about that in book 5. So the soldiers, then he says, would never. It would be unthinkable for them to harm civilians. They only go off and fight the city's enemies. So I'm just putting that there, um, with these other sort of observations about what we sort of see about the Callipolis early on, if we're noting. So now, again, famously, Socrates is kind of done. He says, okay, you guys, he says, now you've got this notion of these soldiers, this military class, and maybe you could talk about how they could be educated to be soldiers because they're a collective entity. And then he's sort of like putting on his toga and leaving or whatever. And Mantis insists that he stay. And Mantis says, look, this is necessary. We definitely need to talk about this. We definitely need to talk about education. But Mantis, again, is still focused. He still says, he just wants to know what's the education that Socrates is going to give to Glaucon. That's really it. He's still got more questions. And he's still going to stay at this level of the many, of the specific. He still isn't done questioning Socrates. And he feels maybe that he has a little right to question Socrates as the oldest brother. And so Socrates is pulled in to this discussion that now goes on all the way through book 5 and the discussion of the marriage and the communal life of the guardians and so on. Against his wishes. So what do we make of that? I mean, he didn't want to talk about it, and yet it is talked about. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about tension between Plato and Socrates. And I'll go through this slide carefully because I think this is basic stuff in terms of pedagogy, in terms of teaching or Plato exposition. So the first one is this. Plato's character, Socrates, makes clear something that follows from his four-matter distinction, and that is that no material thing can ever be formally perfect. Just think of a thing that is participating in a geometrical form. The circle is the intuitively easiest one. You can have concrete circles and metal circles and paper circles, but none of them are going to be perfect circles. The perfect circle is what Plato calls an invisible thing, not a thing that is participating in matter, that is. And that's, I say, a crucial point to make to skeptical first-time readers of Plato. There's people I mentioned, a lot of people, who are inclined to see Plato as overly totalitarian. he's the one who says, well, you couldn't really do this in the real world. At least Socrates is that one. Second bullet point. There is no possibility, according to this understanding of the form matter distinction, which I think is really a pretty standard understanding of the form matter distinction, right? You've got the form and then the matter participating in the form, and then the impression of that, and then the image, and then, you know. As I say, like the Jesuits' Christ, the good is sort of always approachable, never attainable. And that seems to be a kind of sort of common sense view. And it seems to be very much in line with the form matter distinction as it's presented here. And third bullet point, Socrates says to addie, he tries to, he's really kind of getting tired of him. And he says, look, addie, I could describe, 20 different kinds of states and arrangements that all would be examples of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. I mean, it doesn't do much good to give a specific example. That's common, that's the common popular notion of what Socrates keeps saying. I don't want specific examples. Now we see that a little bit more deeply. But then the last bullet point, so Socrates has all this deniability, and Socrates is very reasonable about it all. And it's just a for instance, and he's letting Glaucon off the leash, and they're speculating. And it's the end of the day of the festival and all the rest of that. So we've got all these excuses to say, well, this isn't, but we don't really need to take this that seriously. I mean, he's given us all these flags that, this is counterfactual that's helping us understand these concepts. But last bullet point, it's not so clear about Plato, our author. I mean, he's obviously thought about all these things we're going to see in books 3, 4, and 5 a lot. He's really thought about them a lot, and he's written it all out, and he really wants us to read it. And he does go there where Socrates says there's no reason to go. He doesn't have to go. And he's put all these kinds of, almost like in Russian literature, all these sort of frames around it to make the intention ambiguous. But then he goes on, and I say his description of the family, private property, and the state. I mean, I put that in quotes because that's a famous book by Friedrich Engels, a famous Marxist book from the 19th century. The origin of the family, private property, and the state. And Plato's texts here are sort of along those lines. His position and thinking is less clear. It's not as obvious what Plato really thinks. He's the one who says, no, I am going to tell him about all this stuff specifically. Also, Plato went out in real life, in his life, he went out to the Syracusan tyrant Dion and tried to see if they could instantiate some of these policies in real life. He's more provocative, and he's cagier than Socrates. Socrates very artfully has made some plausible distance here, some plausible deniability. But then Plato goes ahead and gives us the whole story. Socrates isn't Plato's mouthpiece. It's really not at all. It's not as simple as that. Another thing to talk about is nature and nurture in Plato. We're almost getting towards the end here. I think we have one or two more slides. If you sort of were educated over the last 50 years, what you got was an understanding of the nature-nurture debate, and sociobiology and evolutionary psychology and all that kind of stuff. Whether people's characters and behaviors were more or less shaped by environment or by genetic determinism, for example. And then this tied into a lot of arguments that might be justifying racist policies, or so the critics said, and so on and so on. Very much a big part of the discourse, a big part of the framing of the discussion, the nature-nurture debate. But that can be confusing when we look at Plato. Plato thinks that there is a one transcendental nature to all rational beings. You think about the metaphysics of mathematics. And so is sort of the ultimate essentialist, as Jean-Paul Sartre thought when he made up those words, essentialist and existentialist. But Plato doesn't see how that goes against sort of behavioristic notions of the way that the environment shapes people at all. In fact, Plato's positively obsessive. He's like B.F. Skinner. He thinks that you have to very, very rigidly control all of the things that are stimulating and influencing an impressionable young person. So he thinks because he thinks it's up for grabs. you might sink back down into matter, or you might manage to flourish and evolve upwards into form. And that's in fact exactly why it's so urgent and so obsessively important that we maintain the proper kinds of cultural inputs and other examples for the youth. So for Plato, nature and nurture are not separate. They are some sort of really together thing where, because of the nature of things, because of the nature of the form matter distinction, it is of the utmost urgency that we have very much an operationalist approach to the way that we're stimulating the young. So, okay, that's it. I mean, at the end of the book two, finally he gets to Adimantus. Finally, I mean, Adimantus keeps getting worse. A good thing about these CDC Reeve translations is that you get all this, by the way. And he interrupts again. Adimantus always only interrupts Socrates. Adimantus only starts talking when Socrates is talking, and he interrupts Socrates 6 times just in this little passage, saying, which one, which poem, be specific. I mean, we have our poems, tell me which ones. And Socrates is impatient with Adimantus right back. He laughs at Adimantus. We're not going to write the poems ourselves. But third bullet point, he finally meets Adimantus sort of halfway. And he says this, that this is the world is described by the Ionian naturalists, but also the world described by the Homeric myths, which Socrates and Plato Socrates very much disapproves of those as well. We've already seen why. He doesn't like the content, but part of what he doesn't like about it is the same thing that he doesn't like about the Ionian naturalism, and that is this violent, paradoxical, chaotic cosmos that's described. So he says, look, he thinks gods ought to be presented as moral, moral models. He thinks that culture, the protagonists in culture, both in the myths and in the poetry, ought to be honest and strong and embody the virtues and be role models for young people who read those poems or see those plays. And that sounds good. And Adimantus says, yeah, okay, then if that's the way you feel, then that sounds good. And so what's happened then is that the brothers, Adimantus and Glaucon, they weren't sure, and they were still thinking about what Thrasymachus has said. Glaucon's saying he couldn't quite decide. And now Adimantus at least has the confidence after this discussion in book two, he's going to listen to what Socrates has to say, just because it sounds good to him. He still doesn't understand much about the underlying philosophy, but he's on board to understand. And so now we go on to these really extraordinary books, 3, 4, and 5, starting with book 3 next. Okay. All right. So book 2 then, and I'll see you later. Okay. Bye-bye.